Good evening, everybody, and good evening to all who are watching online. And welcome to the first Mixed Mess of 2025. My name is Geraldine Andrews. I'm a Lady Justice of the Court of Appeal of England and Wales. And it's my great privilege to be the Treasurer of Gray's Inn for this year. And I wanted to say a few words, not only of introduction to our distinguished speaker this evening, but just to explain a little bit about the theme for the mixed messes and for some of the talks, qualifying sessions we're going to have this year. Education is very much at the heart of what the Inn does, and it's also very much a matter that is close to my own heart. It's my theme for this year. And when I was thinking about it, it occurred to me that, of course, nowadays the received wisdom is not that advocates spring fully fledged from the womb and are born not made. We all now recognize that advocacy is a performance skill that can be taught. But when I was a young barrister and in the generations before me, it was still quite commonplace for word to go around from clerk to clerk that a great advocate was appearing in a court near you, and the pupils would flock to watch that person perform. And just as you can be inspired by great performances in any area of life, such as sport or music or drama, it is possible to watch somebody who just has that extra magic touch. And they have got something which is impossible to define, but it makes them stand out from the rest of the crowd. Trouble is that for great barristers, the names live on, but you don't see the performances. Because although nowadays some performances are live streamed and might be there available on YouTube for the future, that didn't happen even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And many of these people will now have passed on, and the people who have seen them perform before too long will all have passed on too. And it's important, I think, for you to know a little bit about their legacy so that you can feel a little bit of that sprinkling of fairy dust in your lives too, and perhaps go on to be inspired by what made them great. Now, it takes a great one to know a great one. So it's an enormous pleasure for me to be able to introduce to you our guest speaker this evening, Michael Beloff KC. I have known Michael since I was a very, very junior barrister. I had the great privilege of being led by him. It would take me more than the 5 minutes allotted to me to be able to do justice to his enormous CV. Anybody who's interested, there is a fabulous memoir he has written called MJBQC, which is still available from Wildies and on Amazon. And I do recommend it to you, not least because there is quite a lot in it about George Carman, who is this evening's subject of the lecture. Michael has, among many other talents, a great knowledge, a vast knowledge, probably more than anybody else in the field of sports law. He's affectionately known as the godfather of sports law. And if there is some kind of appellate body or jurisdictional body that deals with regulatory matters in sport, Michael's been on it. I've often said to him, if there was an adjudication panel for disputes about the World Tiddlywinks Championships, Michael would be on it and probably is. But anyway, he's also been the Master of Trinity College, Oxford, and it's one of my great abiding memories that he came out of that job specifically to lead me in a case at one point. And that is a memory that I will cherish for the rest of my life. But anyway, Michael has done me the great honor of opening this series of lectures. And so without more ado, Michael, please can I invite you to come and address us on the subject of George Carman.
Thank you, Master Treasurer, for that kind introduction, over-kind introduction. Few 20th century barristers are the subject of two biographies. My researches have identified only Marshall Hall and Patrick Hastings, who were accorded that tribute other than George Carman, the subject of my lecture. The first life of Carman, entitled No Ordinary Man by his son Dominic, was remarkably unfilial. of the warts and all school of scholarship. The second, far more sympathetic by his companion and confidant, the lawyer Karen Phillips, was entitled Get Carman, not, as I initially surmised, a play on the gangster film named Get Carter, but rather a reflection of the imperative instruction regularly given to their solicitors by media outlets sued for libel. In fact, neither book would have seen the light of day but for Carman's premature demise in 2001, since he had negotiated a contract for an autobiography and even drafted some initial chapters. Had he completed that work, he would simply have joined the far more common herd of barrister memorialists. In his death, as in his life, as I shall show, chance played a leading role. Carman, counsel for a host of celebrities, himself became a celebrity counsel. He attracted a range of flattering sobriquets: Gorgeous George, Giorgio Carmani, the Silver Fox, the Great Defender, the King of Libel. The published reflections of those he acted for and those against whom he acted, as well as those with whom he acted in either capacity, provide ample material by which to judge his reputation as an advocate. In my case, the material is flavored by some personal reminiscence. I intend in this lecture to sketch out his life, name-checking his most famous cases, and then seek to answer how, through such cases, he achieved such forensic fame. En route to that destination, I may hazard some thoughts which may be of utility to those of you about to embark on a career of which Master Bingham so memorably said, "It's where the magic is." George Carman was born in 1929. His father was an auctioneer of furniture, his mother a seamstress, and by the standards of the bar of the 1950s, when he entered the profession, his origins could fairly be described as humble. After religious schooling, on the basis of his performance in the modern subject scholarship examination, he won a place as a commoner at Balliol College, Oxford, to read jurisprudence. The blind law fellow, Theo Tyler, advised him at his interview that as he had no family or friends in the law, he ought to become a solicitor. After the mandatory national service, Carman went up to Oxford in 1949 and graduated in 1952 with the joint top first of his year, sharing that podium position with Nicholas Brown Wilkinson, later the senior law lord. Two other Oxford events transformed Carman's career. He lost his North Country accent and he gained a friend in Jeremy Thorpe, the future Member of Parliament and leader of the Liberal Party. Inspired by reading about the great advocates, he was called to the bar by Lincoln's Inn in 1953 with a certificate of honor in his bar finals. Though rejecting Theo Tyler's cautious advice, he made use of Tyler's legal links by obtaining a pupillage in the Harcourt Chambers of Neil Lawson, a future High Court judge. Without other money or London connections, Carman decided to practice in Manchester at Chambers in 60 King Street, whose head, Geoffrey Halpern, labored under the false impression that he was Jewish. After practice on the Northern Circuit, which was generalist with both criminal and civil elements, rather than the specialist trends of today, he took silk in 1971, joining another Manchester set in Barham Street. In accordance with the convention of the time, as a freshly fledged QC, he also acquired a seat in Associated London Chambers at 5 Essex Court. He became a recorder in 1972 and appeared destined for a lucrative but unmemorable career at the provincial bar. Success as a barrister demands a coincidence of luck and talent. Carman's fortunes waxed when in 1973, he defended on a charge of manslaughter the manager of the Battersea Fairground Big Dipper, on which 5 children had lost their lives. This brought him to the attention of David Napley, a leading solicitor specializing in criminal law who was representing another defendant. As a result, Carman was instructed by Napley to defend Jeremy Thorpe against a charge of conspiracy to murder his former lover, the stable boy Norman Scott, at a trial in 1979. It was not, in fact, Napley's first choice. That was John Matthew, a doyen of the criminal bar. But Matthew had already accepted a brief for David Holmes, another defendant in the same trial. Nor was Carman an obvious choice. Graham Bowl, his junior, wrote in his own memoir that when told of his leader's identity, quote, "My immediate reaction was, George who? I'd never heard of George Carman." Carman's successful defense of Thorpe made him a household name. But those of you who enjoy counterfactuals may legitimately speculate as to whether, but for the triple fortuity of Carman's balliol friendship with Thorpe, Napley's single encounter with Carman as an advocate, and Matthew's unavailability, we would ever have heard of George Carman. In the wake of, but surely because of, the Thorpe trial, Carman attracted a roster of clients in high-profile criminal trials. He acted in 1980 for Lord Cavan, the Gannex tycoon ennobled by Harold Wilson, charged with failing to pay customs duty. In 1981 for Leonard Arthur, the doctor charged with murdering a baby with Down syndrome by his instruction to the nursing team, nursing care only. In 1982 for Geoffrey Prime, the GCHQ staffer charged with treason by supplying secret information to Russia. In 1983 for the Coronation Street star, Peter Adamson, charged with indecently assaulting two young girls at a swimming bath, and in 1989 for Ken Dodd, the comedian charged with tax evasion. Carman's skill with a jury was well established by the acquittals he obtained for Arthur, Adamson, and Dodd. But it took Oscar Buseling, the Mirror Group's in-house solicitor, to recognize that those skills could be transplanted to the field of libel, the last area in civil law where the tribunal of fact was still ordinarily the same 12 lay persons. So that it was in the last decade of his life, Carman acted in an amplitude of high-profile defamation cases. In the United States of America, libel practitioners tended to opt between being a plaintiff's or being a defendant's lawyer. But in England, our legal culture imposed no such choice on a barrister. The cab rank rule would never justify turning down a brief for one client in the absence of a genuine conflict of interest because another client, actual or potential, would, if a barrister accepted that brief, cease to instruct him or her. But Carman acted both for and against the media, and though there's no evidence that his clients on both sides of that divide objected to this catholicity of approach. His list of clients, broadsheets and tabloids apart, reads like a list culled exclusively from who's who. They included Richard Branson, Imran Khan, Elton John, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, Lawrence Dallaglio, Mohammed Al-Fayed, and Robert Maxwell. His victims, some almost equally well known, included Sonia Sutcliffe, the wife of the Yorkshire Ripper, who sued the News of the World for alleging that she had had an holiday affair with a Greek lookalike of her husband. Janie Allen, a South African journalist, who sued Channel 4 for alleging that she'd had an affair with a white separatist leader, Eugene Terre-Blanche. Gillian Tailforth, the EastEnders actress, my own client, who sued The Sun for alleging she had given her boyfriend oral sex in a lay-by off the A1. Neil Hamilton, who sued Mohammed Al-Fayed for alleging that he had taken cash in brown envelopes as a fee for raising questions on Al-Fayed's behalf in Parliament. Jonathan Aitken, who sued The Guardian for alleging sundry improper activities by him for Arab interests, including having his stay at the Ritz Hotel in Paris paid for by the business manager of a Saudi prince. And Ian Botham, who sued Imran Khan for alleging that he was a racist and a cheat. Despite his student academic distinction, Carman was always happiest addressing the 12 men and women of a jury, though the Aitken action was heard because of its complexity by a judge alone. In his mature years, he left jurisprudence to his juniors. I recollect in the opening day of the Haleforth case, when he made a series of interlocutory applications, all of which failed, his leaning back uncharacteristically from his position in the front row with his ear cocked to indulge in a sotto voce dialogue with his junior on points of law. And when I once appeared against him in the commercial court, he was visibly outside his comfort zone. His name only appears in the law reports 30 times, 6 of which refer to the same case, and none of them created some major precedent. The Hamilton case raised a preliminary issue on parliamentary privilege, but it was I, not Carman, who was instructed to argue it before the House of Lords, and I should add, lost it. It's almost as if Carman felt that fluency in law would somehow undermine his capacity to address juries on fact and on their wavelength. So what were the springs of his success? To mix a metaphor, the picture is one of shade as well as of light. The concept of a life-work balance was wholly alien to him. His professional clearly took clear priority over his private life. Thrice married, he was also thrice divorced. He moved in 1982 to Newcourt Chambers, of which he became head, but in an ornamental rather than an executive sense. He had no interest in promoting the careers of others. Cherie Blair, a junior in that set, writes acidly, "Selfish and George were two terms that definitely went together." Carman also wandered on the dark side. He was addicted both to gambling and to alcohol, but there's no evidence that he ever appeared drunk in court or even that his performance was impaired by alcohol. Graham Bowl, himself an occasional victim to alcoholism, his memoirs revealingly entitled A Drink at the Bar, tells of the evening before Carman was due to cross-examine Peter Bessel, the main Crown witness in the Thorpe case. And I quote verbatim, "I," that's Bowl, "had drunk too much the night before, though nothing compared with George's intake." Bowl next records that he was only at 10:27, a bare 3 minutes before kickoff, that Carman swept into court with, and I quote again, "the telltale smell of peppermint, the beads of sweat on the back of his neck, and the slightest tremble of his hands as he rearranged his papers." But this is a story with a happy ending, summarized by Bowl as follows: "For the next 2 days, I sat spellbound, completely mesmerized by what is best described as an Oscar-winning performance." Now, my lecture is not required by the Bar Standards Board to carry a health warning, but I would respectfully suggest to you that Carman's indubitable successes were achieved despite and not because of these defects, indeed vices. His stamina, let alone his metabolism, must have been extraordinary. Carman also suffered from a sense of insecurity, the obverse side of his relish for publicity. He never fully felt himself to be a member of the bar's inner circle. As an impromptu, if somewhat superficial exercise, I checked the secondary schooling of Carman's most regular opponents in libel cases. They were respectively Eton, Winchester, Marlborough, and Bryanston. And it's not fanciful to suggest that Carman always wanted to prove to the world that he was not only as good, but better than the posh boys. He was indeed anxious to become a High Court judge as a definitive form of validation, and frustrated in that aim, agreed in 1981 to take an equivalent position in Hong Kong. This was an agreement which he promptly resigned for fiscal reasons, but which, had he pursued it, would also in all likelihood have meant that he ended his legal life in relative obscurity. Now, on the plus side of the ledger, he devoted a vast amount of time to preparation of his briefs, including discussion with his juniors as to tactics and trialing with them the potential mot juste or fitting phrase for his submissions. Carman had his fallow periods, and even more rarely a string of losses. But remember, all of you, that the best advocates are often retained precisely because of the difficulty of the cases they're instructed to argue. And Carman's response was very much like that of the cart-horse boxer in George Orwell's fable Animal Farm, to work harder. Even the best advocates sometimes fear that they are seen as only as good as their last case. Next to preparation outside court, Carman had presence in it. Now, great height can advantage an advocate, but Carman showed that size isn't everything. Variously described as diminutive and dapper, and standing at 5'3" only, as his son put it, in wig and gown, he grew in height and stature, the former, I presume, only metaphorically. James Price, KC, a regular junior, gives a pen portrait of Carman in action rather than in inaction. I quote, "When not on his feet, he sat still and quiet, not slouched, and looking straight at the witness or judge. When on his feet, he stood also still and upright, or leaned forward on the lectern for emphasis, hands to side, or leaning on it, but never leaning back, never gesturing, never pacing up and down. He wanted no distraction for the jury." His voice was another asset. Purged at Balliol of the northern vowels of his childhood and adolescent years, it was, in Price's words, classless and gravelly, roughened by his ceaseless smoking. His manner was unhurried, giving the jury ample time to digest what he was saying. Famous as a cross-examiner, he was no less skilled at examining in chief, a skill which is increasingly made redundant when witness statements have to be exchanged in advance of a trial. In either exercise, he favored questions both simple and direct, sometimes changing his tone and emphasis to focus the jury's attention. In submission, he crafted memorable phrases magnified next day in newspaper headlines. Of Sonia Sutcliffe, "She danced on the graves of her husband's victims. The truth and Sonia do not make good bedfellows." Of Neil Hamilton, "He was on the make and on the take, and a man with no honor left." Of Ken Dodd, "Some accountants are comedians, but comedians are never accountants." His technique of delayed surprise with documents, which exposed a lack of veracity in a person that he was cross-examining, a feature of several of his cases, became known in legal circles quasi-eponymously as doing a Carman. Now, was this regular acquisition of compelling evidence a late happenstance of which he took full advantage, or actually a sleight of hand which verged on the unethical, since to have concealed disclosable documents from the other parties of the litigation would have been a breach of the civil procedure rules? The record suggests that the former, the more benign explanation. Jonathan Aitken had survived many days of vigorous cross-examination, eliciting admiration even from the journalist for The Guardian, the defendant of the case, who wrote, "Aitken's performance in the witness box over 8 days was awesome." But at almost the last minute, The Guardian's lawyer obtained a ticket from British Airways, which proved that Aitken's wife could not, as he had claimed, pay his Ritz Hotel bill because she was not even in Paris at the time. And on this relatively minor part of the Guardian case against him, which had otherwise not been sustained, Aitken inevitably threw his hand in. On the second day of the Joni Allen case, a paper parcel, provenance unknown, was delivered to George Carman, care of the Royal Court of Justice. It contained Allen's private diary. Allen had once said, on the record, that it would have been against her principles to have an affair with a married man, such as was Terre Blanche. The diary on its face disclosed she had indeed had an affair with another married man called Riccardo, an Italian airliner pilot. Allen's case never recovered from Carman's expert deployment of that diary entry. In the Tailforth case, the actress had survived a first round of cross-examination by Carman. As Karen Phillips put it in her biography, quote, "By the end of the first week, there was a general feeling that Tailforth had been unjustly maligned. She seemed, if not prim, a very proper person and a concerned mother." But Lady Luck delivered yet another rabbit for Carman to take out of his hat or wig. A student at an anniversary party for a theatre school had happened to record a video which included a salacious dance by Tailforth simulating oral sex with a bottle. Reading press reports of Tailforth's evidence, the student recognized the tape's possible value and sold it to the Sun. Once Mr. Justice Drake had ruled the video admissible, Carman was able, by a second round of cross-examination, to suggest that the earlier impression Tailforth had sought to make on the jury as a woman of unimpeachable modesty was simply false, and that this was the turning point in the case is quite indisputable. The Sun won the case by a majority verdict of 10-2. There is, however, one episode in a not dissimilar context which shows that Carman was not always wholly scrupulous. In 1981, unlike today, the defense in the criminal trial had no duty to disclose its hand in terms of the evidence it relied on, with the important exception of expert evidence. In the Arthur case, the defense had an expert report which challenged the Crown's expert on a critical issue, the cause of the baby's death. Was it, as the prosecution claimed, the inevitable, indeed the intended result of Arthur's instruction to the nursing team, or might it have had an alternative cause, that the baby had been born with significant brain and lung damage? Bowl, once again Carman's junior, urged Carman to follow the rule and disclose the defense expert's reports. Carman declined to do so. The Crown's expert, taken by surprise, said he could not positively contradict the defendant's expert's opinion. Prosecuting counsel Douglas Greycott of Queen's Counsel had, of course, objected to the introduction of that evidence, saying it appeared unsupported by concrete medical evidence. But it may be unsurprisingly, given what was at stake, the judge allowed Carman to continue. Later in the robing room, Carman asserted to Greycott that Bowl, who was a Treasury counsel at the Old Bailey, had said to him that if Bowl had been prosecuting, he would not have made the objection that Greycott had made. That was the exact opposite of what Bowl had said to Carman, and in his memoir, Bowl wrote, "The whole ugly event left me with a very unpleasant taste in my mouth." There's another episode recorded by Bowl which Carman may have ignored, the French precept, pas trop de zèle, not too much zeal. At a time when, unlike today, the failure of a defendant to give evidence could not be subject of adverse comment by either Crown or court, 3 of the 4 defendants in the Thorpe case chose not to do so. That shared decision was the product of negotiation between the counsel's team in what Bowl has described as an elaborate game of bluff and counterbluff. In broad terms, an agreement had been reached that no counsel party to that decision would, in his speech, make any critical comment about the other 2 defendants. Despite that agreement, Carman suggested in his speech that one interpretation of the evidence was that Holmes, Matthew's client, had conspired with others to kill Scott behind Thorpe's back and without Thorpe's knowledge. Bowl writes, "In view of the agreements we had reached with John Matthew, I felt extremely uncomfortable when I heard that, and John Matthew was understandably very cross." Now, without purporting to pass judgment on Carman's behavior in these 2 untypical episodes, I would only emphasize to the students in hall that your proper commitment to your client's cause does not outweigh all other considerations, not only your paramount duty to the court, but the trust that your opposing counsel is entitled to expect from you. Of course, to the extent that Carman may have, on isolated occasions, if he did, trespass beyond the boundary of proper behavior, does not cancel out the qualities he displayed for the overwhelming majority of his career, any more than the propensity of a striker to commit the odd professional foul cancels his record achievements as a goal scorer. Sometimes Carman's appetite for combat simply impaired his judgment. Donald Trelford, editor of The Observer, defended to a claim brought by the sometime Minister Edwina Currie, who'd been inadvertently named in an article about a film featuring a female politician who murdered her husband, wrote in his memoir, Shouting in the Street, "We might have won if our counsel, the legendary George Carman, hadn't gone over the top in his cross-examination, annoying the judge by showing a sundry mirror feature of the lady in her underwear." But such was Carman's charisma that judges tend to give him indulgences denied to lesser advocates. In the Arthur case, Carman called a string of doctors to say that in Arthur's position, they would have acted in the same way as he did. In the Ken Dodd case, Carman called a string of witnesses to testify to the comedian's generosity and popularity. Neither strategy, on strict analysis, supplied any defense at all to the offenses with which they'd been charged, though both might have featured by way of mitigation after conviction had the cases ever reached that stage. But Carman's closing speech in the Arthur case was rightly described by Bowl as a forensic masterpiece. Bypassing the reality that the law does not recognize mercy killing, he had an imperishable peroration about his client. He could, like Pontius Pilate, have washed his hands of the matter. He did not, because good doctors do not turn away. Are we condemn him as a criminal because he helped two people, mother and child, at the time of their greatest need? Are we to condemn a doctor because he cared? In the Thorpe case, having decided not to call his client, he nonetheless included in his speech reference to the tragedies in his client's life, including the loss of Thorpe's first wife in a motoring accident. As Bowl notes, it is not for counsel to give evidence, but the judge did not stop him, nor did the prosecutor, who was none other than Peter Taylor, a future Lord Chief Justice, make any objection. Indeed, Carman, who was a master of the art of robing room advocacy, persuaded Taylor to accept as a sufficient agreed fact that it is admitted that Mr. Scott had reason to believe that Thorpe had homosexual tendencies. And this agreement, of course, foreclosed the calling of any further evidence by the Crown about Thorpe's well-known homosexuality. And it enabled Carman to end his speech, drawing a distinction between the votes that Thorpe had solicited in elections to Parliament and the more important vote by which he sought his liberty from each member of the jury, dramatically pointed to and addressed by Carman one by one, you, and you. It's trite to say of any famous person, whether in obituaries, at memorial services, or in commemorative lectures such as this, we shall not see his like again. But in Carman's case, there is a plausible reason, which has nothing to do with his personal talents, but rather with the circumstances in which he displayed them. During his heyday as a libel advocate, the presumption was that defamation cases in England would be tried by jury. Section 11 of the Defamation Act of 2013, which postdated his death, reversed the presumption. Today, defamation trials are usually tried without a jury. Could Carman have prospered in this changed legal environment? He could have gone into reverse and retrod his path as a criminal advocate, since even as a last resort to diminish the law's delays in the criminal courts, the right to trial by jury for less serious offences is removed. It's all but inconceivable that any such change would abolish juries in the kind of cases fit for a silk of Carman's standing. But to evaluate the standing of Carman in action notionally in 2025 can be no more than a parlour game. In his last year of practice, after the dissolution of his new court chambers, Carman joined the 4 to 5 Gray's Inn Square set, of which I was then the head. And with that proper declaration of interest, I will confidently assert that he would have found a way not only to survive, but to succeed. His clients, unsurprisingly, sung his praises at high volume. Unsurprisingly, his victims were generally not disposed to speak kindly of him. But it's to Joni Allen, that I can leave the last and most telling word, spoken under oath, to Carman, her tormentor at the trial. What she said was this: whatever award is given for libel, being cross-examined by you would not make it enough money. Much. Question time. Oh, I love having questions. And it's always a delay before the first one. And then after the first one, you tend to run out of time. So get your question in first.
I have a question. First of all, thank you very much. That was fascinating, and I learned a great deal. But if you could choose one aspect, George Carman, that you think would inspire the pupils and the students here, can you say what that would be?
That's really a very good question, because you can tell this was not a lecture which painted him simply in glowing and golden colors. I suppose what I would say that he, as I say, the presence that he managed to give to judge, jury, opposing counsel, witnesses, whoever was in court, was really, in a sense, unmatched. You were riveted by it. You wanted to watch him. You wanted to listen to him. And even if, like I was in one famous trial, on the losing side, you always enjoyed the experience nonetheless. Oh, not even from Manchester. Oh, here we are.
How are you so confident that in the civil cases you referenced, George Carman acted wholly properly in connection with some perhaps slightly improbable ways of obtaining evidence at the last moment, when you also have in your speech revealed some examples in the criminal field where if he acted, if not improperly, at least slightly on the wrong side of the line?
Let me put it like this. I would have every motive as the losing counsel in the Tailforth case for saying, as I certainly do say, but for this last minute evidence, he would certainly have lost the case. I mean, it was 10-2, bare majority, and the jury spent several days deciding it. But I actually would need to disbelieve what was said by, in particular, the newspaper, that this came up late in the day, and it was inspired only by someone who'd already read about how Gillian had presented herself in the examination, and no doubt concluded, well, that's not the Gillian Tailforth I remember, and therefore was moved, admittedly, for a price to produce this. But I mean, all that, as it were, fitted together, it being late in the day. And frankly, it was luck. And I for a while, I mean, there's not I can say this, we're not Chatham House rules, everyone's dead, most of them, apart from me. No one in the case, on the other side, there were police representatives, the newspaper representatives, every one of them has said to me, of course you would have won the case, but for this. Only person who never conceded it to me was George, but there we are. That's what happens. He was lucky. Luck, I don't know whether it's encouraging or discouraging to say to you, luck does play a very considerable part in a barrister's career. I know that from my own personal experience, and I know that now by looking at the experience of someone like George Carman. There were several junctures in his life where if something different had happened, we would never have heard of him at all. There's another lady there. Over there, someone there. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize.
Thank you, Master Beloff. We heard at the beginning from Master Treasurer that too often today's advocates won't be able to see the grandeur of the advocates of days gone by, but we now have modern technology that allows us to observe quality of advocacy. You said that there were 3 advocates of the 20th century who had 2 biographies, Carman being one of them. Who's going to be the next one to have those 2 biographies, or who's going to be the advocate that you've seen in recent years that you would encourage students today to keep their eye on?
I'd go and watch my old and most distinguished pupil, Lord Panic. It costs a great deal to instruct him, but it doesn't cost anything to go to court and look at him, and in particular when he's appearing in the Supreme Court, they have been streaming for quite a while. I mean, the odd thing is when you get to my stage, many of my juniors have become High Court judges, appellate judges, judges in European courts, even the Supreme Court. And of course, most of them I haven't actually seen. I had the experience, actually, I can tell you this very shortly, the other night, of seeing at a debate, Eleanor Sharpston, who was a junior in my chambers and who became Advocate General in the European Court of Justice. I'd never heard her. She was speaking on a very interesting debate about international courts, and there were some very senior and eloquent persons presenting case both sides. But when Eleanor got up, I realized immediately she must have been a formidable advocate. What were the strengths she displayed in the debate? First of all, she spoke very slowly. Most people, in particular young advocates, tend to speak too fast. Secondly, she told the audience, these are the points I'm going to make. And thirdly, and this is really critical, when she said finally, she actually meant finally. Most advocates, when they say finally, it's actually the prelude to 3 equivalent adverbs to be used. And there's a sense of disappointment when they actually don't sit down. In her case, there was just a sense of relief. She's done exactly an excellent job. And that's, as I say, the kind of experience I have. I mean, David used to appear against me in my later years when I was in full-time practice. So, of course, I got to know his quality very well. But quite recently, when he was defending the government actually over the Rwanda case, I thought I would just go and like to see whether he's as good as he always was. They always say he is. Yes, he was.
Thank you very much for your talk. You spoke about the abolition of juries as one change to defamation law. I wondered, how else do you see this area of law as having evolved or yet to evolve, especially in light of the phenomenon of fake news and the degree to which we consent to often give away personal details about ourselves just through the advent of technology and privacy issues?
What you touch upon is something that's actually of very considerable interest to those who specialize in that particular area. You have fewer defamation cases now because they are expensive, because the amount of damages you can recover have been capped partly as a result of the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights, and partly because other issues have emerged which demand perhaps the same kind of qualities and interest in what A says about B and so on, which are really their privacy issues and now that kind of data protection issues. So the defamation bar tends to have migrated to those particular areas. And of course, there's the other problem is that until there's, as it were, full disclosure about who said what on some kind of on social media, it's very difficult to identify who the defendant's going to be, who's going to be liable. And the last thing I would say from my own experience, I mean, I did a certain amount of defamation cases. I mean, five actually quite long jury cases, one of which lasted 98 days against the BBC, after which they threw their hand in. But one of the things I do remember is always saying to clients then, plaintiffs who wanted to sue, I said, do remember, first of all, just wait for a little time. I mean, if you don't sue immediately, it's not going to be held against you. You shouldn't wait for a year or so, because you may think better of it. And secondly, do remember that the one thing the case will do is to republicize allegations that you would prefer to have forgotten. And you'd be surprised how many people thought that that was prudent advice. And I think that if most barristers, after all, you are meant to give the best advice you can to the client, irrespective of your personal interest in earning some large fee or other, that means that people are deterred and sensibly deterred from bringing actions at all. So those kind of more general considerations, as well as the way of the world and it's changing the way you describe, are the reasons why I think you have less defamation and more other aspects of media intrusion and the like.
There's one online. In light of quick and tireless advances in technology and the way in which such advances are affecting the legal system at large, do you think the art of great advocacy might be lost as the use of technology continues to increase?
I often look back and think my great good fortune was to practice before there were these great advances in technology. I describe myself in my memoir as an analog barrister in a digital age. But I think the answer is that no one, at least I hope this is right, no one is going to be able to substitute by technology the fluency of the natural or the advocate trained by the Gray's Inn education team. I mean, these are just not qualities that a machine will ever have. They may do all kinds of ways, and the Master Rolls is very keen on this, of reducing the volume of, obviously, of documentation, the digesting of information, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, if you're going to have a case that has to be argued, you're going to have for the foreseeable future, and certainly in my lifetime, advocates, human advocates, to represent the client.
On your behalf, can I once again thank Michael for that very, very illuminating talk. It brought it all back. I had the great good fortune to see that final speech in the Thorpe trial by George Carman, and it was one of the most mesmerizing performances I've ever seen in my life. When he got up and said to the jury, my client has had many votes in his lifetime, but there are no votes that count more than yours and yours and yours and yours. The hairs crept up on the back of my neck. And I think for a young advocate to see a performance like that is truly, well, here I am many, many years later, remembering it now as if I was sitting in the public gallery. And I think that is the power of great advocacy. So thank you, Michael, for at least being able to give us a thumbnail sketch of the great man and sharing your memories of him with us. It's our great good fortune to be able to listen, as I said, to a great advocate talking about a great advocate.